storyteller, author, and he's a veterans advocate. He served in Vietnam as a Army platoon sergeant, 1st Cavalry Division. He was awarded a Purple Heart, Bronze Star, the Air Medal, and the Combat Infantryman's Badge. He's author of a book called One Young Soldier. And I'm going to plug this because we've got a few copies back there, and I think you would autograph them if they're interested. $20, is that correct? Mm-hmm. $20, and the proceeds go to the Wounded Warrior organization. I want to tell you, I'm reading it. I'm currently on chapter 50, and it is a page turner. So I'd highly recommend it. He says it's a novel, but with my conversation with him, I see a lot of what's written in there is his past. So it's based on the Vietnam wartime experiences. And again, I want to say he's an active supporter of veterans initiatives and human service charity organizations. You know, the Vietnam War on April 10th ended with the evacuation of Saigon. And we all remember probably the video with the helicopter, the last helicopter out with the people scrambling, both civilians and Vietnam folks to try and get on board. And I had the pleasure a few years ago to meet that pilot. He lives in the Kansas City area. But Gary's going to talk about a number of things, but in this book, I want to read just a brief excerpt, which is the Family G version on the back cover. But it goes like this: hell, if it exists, it can't be much worse than this. 46 days without a bath. Jungle rot sores up and down both arms, oozing pus, stinking like the death. Living on bomb crater water, sea rations, white bread, peanut butter, and cigarettes. Sweat all the time. Clothes get so crusted with sweat they stiffen up at night when you sleep. Haven't had clean jungle fatigues for almost a month now. Mosquitoes swarm you every night. Leeches climb on you. Suck your blood and anytime you get near water. No weekends, no holidays, never a day off. The nights are the hardest. Can't smoke, can't talk. Just stare into the darkness. Listen to the lizards and the bugs. Try to stay awake and listen for the gooks. An hour here at night is an eternity. At some point, you stop believing you're going to make it. Gary, as I indicated, was a Army grunt. You know, you meet a lot of people that served in Vietnam, and the politicians send our young people to war, but it's the grunts in the bush that take care of that. So, Gary, would you come and share your story?
One moment while I crank up the PowerPoint. Can you hear me all right? Good. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk today. I enjoy doing that. Especially want to thank Ron and Steve Zimmerman, who introduced me to the organization. Steve and I met in a class that we took about a month ago. And I should reveal to you that Steve is now an expert on stock market, stock and options trading. So if you need any investment advice, he's the guy you want to talk to about it. Right, Steve?
And I've got a bridge I'd like to say.
We had a lot of fun together. So I guess I've already been introduced. The part that Ron read, that was actually the good part of the war. It was worse than that, actually. My family has a long tradition of serving in America's wars. Nobody was a professional military type, but somehow people from my family wound up in the wars as far back as we can trace back to the Civil War. This fine-looking young man is my Uncle Ted. I show his picture because my first memory in this lifetime was when I was 4 years old. It was February of 1951. I was playing on the living room floor at our house in Moberly, Missouri. And the living room floor was that old linoleum. It was spotted. And my mother, her older brother, my mother was next youngest of 10 kids. And this gentleman, my Uncle Ted, was the youngest of the 10. The 10 who lived, there were a couple who didn't make it. So my mom's older brother came to the house to let us know that my Uncle Ted had been killed while serving with the 1st Cavalry Division in Korea. He was awarded the Purple Heart and the Silver Star for his heroism in that action. There are some photographs of him. The one at the bottom is the last one we have of him, taken shortly before he was killed. So I bring up the linoleum because if I close my eyes, I can still see the pattern of that linoleum. It got kind of imprinted from the horrible shock and trauma of my mom. She collapsed to the floor. She went into a period of mourning and grief and withdrawal that didn't end. My mom lived to be 85 and she was still going through that when she passed away. I wrote the book, One Young Soldier, a couple of years before my mom died, and I debated about whether to give her a copy of it because the first chapter is a version of my Uncle Ted's death that I wrote from the combat action reports my sister and I got. And I thought, well, I really shouldn't give it to her, but then I figured she might get it some other way, so I did give it to her. And she read the book all the way through once, and then every day for the rest of her life she read that first chapter because she wanted to feel close to my Uncle Ted, even though it was a pretty horrible description of his death. He's up in the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, my family's got a long history of military service. This is my grandfather. He served in World War I. He was in the Army, a machine gunner in Europe, fighting against the Germans in France and Belgium. He was mustard gassed in the early part of 1918. Mustard gas, as you know, was a legal weapon back then, and it basically floods your lungs with your own body fluids. So he nearly died, but he didn't. He survived, but he went through the rest of his life with pretty severe respiratory problems and died at age 64 on a Veterans Administration operating table, undergoing some minor stomach surgery. He was a good guy to my sister and me, but he was a very troubled man through his whole life and had kind of a sad ending. Growing up myself, I wanted to be a pilot. Maybe it was all those great World War II flying movies, because there were some great World War II flying movies. Maybe it was something else, but I just had a real love of flying even as a kid. This is my dad. He was an anti-aircraft gunner serving with the Seabees in the South Pacific in World War II. And indeed all my uncles, and I had 5, except for the one who was killed in Korea, served in World War II. So the family got pretty involved in all that. Anyway, I found out when I was 14, I all of a sudden couldn't see very well and went to the eye doctor and found out I'd be wearing glasses for the rest of my life. So my plans for going to the Air Force Academy were dashed. The Air Force didn't want pilots who couldn't see very well. And I'd been working toward that, so it sort of left me without a goal. This is my cousin who's more like my older brother. He served in the Army in the 50s, was a crew chief on one of the old Sikorsky helicopters. He was actually President Eisenhower's crew chief for a few months before being reassigned. He was also a paratrooper. So anyway, my turn came in with the war that started in Vietnam in 1964. My intent, I graduated high school in 64 and I was going to join the Marine Corps and go off and do my part. I just grew up feeling like everybody else went. I should go too. If we had a war, I ought to be there. But my cousin I just showed you, my brother, he talked me out of it because he figured my mom had had enough grief losing her younger brother and having my dad and all of her other brothers serving in World War II. So instead I went and joined the Kansas Army National Guard because back in those days that was considered a pretty safe way of avoiding being drafted. But I couldn't resist walking through the door of C Company, 2nd Battalion, 137th over in Kansas City, Kansas. Ron served in that same battalion for a while too. and C Company was an infantry company. Just couldn't help myself. Well, we were activated in '68 after we served on riot duty when Martin Luther King was assassinated. When we got back from our week or so of riot duty, they activated us for service in Vietnam. I was a corporal, and they weren't levying corporals into the regular Army infantry because the regular Army didn't have corporal as a rank. They had a Spec 4. So all my buddies were going and I wasn't. So I got crazy toward the end of '68 and went up one day and volunteered. And when I volunteered for the 1st Cavalry Division because my uncle had served there. And also because, you know, the 1st Cav was the division that fought at the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley in '65. They were the helicopter soldiers, and when you saw pictures of them, rather than carrying those real heavy packs, they were flying into battle on helicopters with a light pack and being resupplied every day. And I thought, well, if I'm gonna go fight in the jungle, and I really don't wanna do that, but if I'm gonna, I'd rather be with an air cav unit, so we get resupplied every day, I don't have to carry that big pack, and I get to fly instead of walk. Well, they eventually took me to Vietnam, and when I was being assigned to my unit, the Army made an incredibly unbelievable mistake, I thought. They actually assigned me to the 1st Cavalry Division. I couldn't believe it. I never would have believed in a million years that they would assign me to the unit that I was, that I'd volunteered for. It just couldn't happen, but it did. So here's a painting from the movie We Were Soldiers. Looks pretty classy. And I think we all have a notion that when we go off to war, it's going to be a heroic, brave, not fun, but interesting experience that you survive and come home and you help save the world from communism. I was with Delta Company, 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry. So here's a photograph that's on the cover of the book, and this is of me recent, you know, right after I got there. Still looking pretty clean. My skin's pretty light because I went over in April, and my jungle fatigues are not falling off me. You know, it was a good photo for the cover of the book. Here's one taken a couple months later. I don't know if you can even see me there. Can you see me there?
Yeah.
You know, my skin is turned to the color of dirt because you're in the sun all the time and you're filthy. You're off the fire base for 30, 40, I think 46 days was my personal record. You don't really wear the uniform because it's not very functional, you know, the jungle fatigue shirt. So my uniform was generally a pair of fatigue pants, some grungy, moldy jungle boots, and a t-shirt. And literally, if you took your jungle fatigue shirt to sleep in, you took your t-shirt off at night, when you got up in the morning to put it on, it was stiff. You could pick it up and it was like picking up a sheet of cardboard. We were in the jungle for a really long time without bathing, so you got covered with jungle rot sores and you stunk like death. And you know, we ate C rations. There are 12 C ration meals. In my opinion, there are maybe 4 of them that start off being edible. And 8 that, boy, you'd have to really be starving. And after a while, eating the same 4 meals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day, you get tired of chicken and noodles and all that. So you start coming up with ways of making pizza or whatever out of it. But it gets pretty awful. And I reached a point that's at one point where all I could stomach was the peanut butter, the white bread, and the canned fruit. So I lived on that for a while. Mosquitoes, leeches, all the things that Ron described from the back of the book. It was a far more horrible experience than I could have imagined. You know, the temperature was over 100 degrees pretty much every day. The humidity was in the high 90 percentile. So you got up in the morning and you were a little bit dry, and by the time you humped for, you know, an hour or so, you were soaking wet in your own sweat. You couldn't carry enough water to keep you hydrated, so you wound up reaching the point where you couldn't sweat after a while, and we carried 12 to 16 quarts of water. The 1st Cav had changed its modus operandi between the time I volunteered and the time I got there, of course. And so they decided we shouldn't get resupplied every day because that gave away our position to the enemy. So we started getting resupplied every 3 or 4 or 5 days and carrying 100-pound rucksacks with all of our water and our food and our ammo. And our job was to walk through the jungle, and it was so thick the point man had to chop his way, which made him a very at-risk person because you're up there with a machete making a lot of noise. You never walked a path because you'd be ambushed, so you chopped your way through the jungle. They could hear you coming for a long way, so we lost a lot of point men. I was point man for the first 3 months. Even though I went over as a sergeant, they don't really give you any responsibility until you've been there long enough to demonstrate that you're going to be able to survive. So, sorry. I could go on and describe the nastiness, but you get the point. This is my rifle platoon, the 3rd platoon of Delta Company. We had been out of the field for a couple of days, so they're looking pretty clean. If you can see their faces, the average age is about 19, I would say. I was an old man, I was 22. I was the platoon sergeant at the time this photo was taken. And yes, that is Nui Ba Din Mountain in the background there. Here's a photograph taken from a Huey helicopter over the top of our fire base, LZ Grant. That's the place we look forward to going to when we got out of the field every 30 or 40 days. The little shiny spots are the big puddles of water that are left over after it rains every day. And that circular part at the top, that's the bunker line, the perimeter. And there were bunkers about every 25 yards. And the grunts, when we were on the fire base, we still had the mission of manning the perimeter bunkers and running patrols offside so that we could protect the artillery guys and the medics and the battalion headquarters people. So that nasty mud hole is where we look forward to going when we came out of the field every 30 or 40 days, point of that. This is an interesting photograph because there's several people in it that pop up later in life. This guy with the circle around him is a fellow named Rod Evans. Rod was my squad leader. He was a little bit younger than me, but he had already done one tour with the 101st Airborne and had come back. He came back because his wife was killed in an accident when he was home after his first tour, so he volunteered to come back over. We often thought, hoping that he would make it on the second tour. One day, we walked into a North Vietnamese bunker complex one evening, got into a big firefight, lost some people wounded. Helicopter medevac got called in at the wrong place and got all shot up. Killed everybody on board except for the pilot, who was wounded but still managed to get the bird back to Tay Ninh. They lost 3 people in that one. We stayed there overnight. There were listening posts on the side closest to the enemy, so we were sitting out 30 yards in front of our own perimeter, 3 of us listening to the North Vietnamese speaking in Vietnamese rather loudly, clanging pots and pans, laughing, telling jokes, because they knew the next morning we were going to get ordered to walk in there, and they knew when we did that they were going to kill some of us. Our thought was we should have been pulled back so they could bring in the B-52s and blow it all away, as we were going to ultimately do anyway, and then we'd walk in there, but that wasn't the way they decided we ought to do it that day. So sure enough, we got in, we got up the next morning. We'd run out of food, we'd run out of water, and we were really cranky because we'd run out of cigarettes. And we were the point squad. And long story short, my friend Rod was walking point that morning, and they started blowing anti-personnel mines at us. Rod saw one before it detonated. He dived face first on it. It went off in his face. Took off the bottom of his face and most of his throat and the top of his chest, but he didn't die right away. He unfortunately suffered for a few minutes before he eventually drowned in his own blood. He was the first friend I lost there. Rod was given the Medal of Honor. I found out years later that his 21st birthday had been the day before he was killed. So I miss him. And he's gone. This is Mitchell Hamabata. Mitchell was walking back up for Rod that day. Mitchell made it through the tour, and he went home. He was in the Hawaii National Guard. He went home at the end of '69. He went back to college. He was living with his sister, unmarried, went back to college, was in college for a couple months, and then I found out years later, I talked to his sister, came home one afternoon, sat down on the couch, had, I guess, what was a nervous breakdown. He started talking about the day Rod was killed, because he was right there, and how he just couldn't deal with life anymore. And then he checked out. You know, he became unresponsive, he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't do anything. They checked him into a VA hospital. They tried to help him for about a year, but couldn't get very far with him, so they checked him out of there, put him in a private hospital, where he stayed for the rest of his life. He died in 2004 of ischemic heart disease, a result of his exposure to Agent Orange while he was in Vietnam. So his name's not on the wall in Washington, but in my opinion it ought to be, because he's certainly a casualty of that war. He was a good man. And he's gone. This is Johnny Wild. John had some musical talent. And here we're on the fire base for a couple of days, and John somehow found a guitar, and he played and sang for us. Here he is on a more normal day. He was a machine gunner with our squad. I lost track of him when I came back. He got hurt, pulled out of the field. By the time he got back, I got hurt, pulled out of the field. And I was out in California at a festival, and the festival magazine had a picture of him and his name, and it talked about a decorated Vietnam combat veteran, and I bumped into him after 30-some years, and we got to be really close friends again really fast. It was amazing. His family adopted me. I became honorary grandpa and uncle and dad. Here he is in Kansas City in January of 2006. Here we are together. And as you can see at this point, he's about 58 years old and a fine, healthy looking man, and a hell of a singer. If you want any of his CDs, I can get them for you. I want you to look at his photograph there, because the next one is a photograph of him a year and a half later. After chemo and radiation, Johnny came down with throat cancer, which the VA ultimately attributed to his exposure to Agent Orange. He lived for 4 more years after he was diagnosed, but he had a feeding tube in for the whole time, so he never took a bite of food for that time. And he passed away in 2012. Another good friend who I miss. This is Dave Williams. I wasn't close to Dave in Vietnam. He was there at the same time. We had a reunion here in Kansas City in 2008 that I hosted, and Dave was one of the 9 guys who came from our rifle company. He was a prison guard out in central Kansas. We got the word last year that Dave had been diagnosed with brain cancer, and only a few months later he died, and they attribute that to his exposure to Agent Orange. So here's a photograph of some of us. It was a few days after we had been pulled out of one of our stand downs and told we were being sent into the middle of a big battle with the North Vietnamese. So they said, you know, double up on ammo and don't worry about food and water so much, because we'll resupply you, you know, a day into it. So we doubled up on ammo, and we got out there and there were no North Vietnamese around. They had taken off. And then, of course, the resupply didn't happen for about 3 days. So we're on like day 4, and the point man came across this big snake, about 12 feet long. It's a python. So they killed the snake, and we ultimately chopped it up into steaks. And we cooked it over C4 plastic explosive, which was a lot better to cook on than the heat tabs, because the heat tabs didn't do anything. The C4, we later found out, gives you brain damage if you breathe the fumes, but we didn't know that. And it burns really hot. So we had a chunk of steak about yay big, and it's kind of half moon shaped. So we cooked it over the C4, and it was like charred black on the outside, and it was raw on the inside, and we'd run out of salt and stuff. So I gotta tell you, it does not taste like chicken. It's an interesting photograph in another way. This is Pete Connor. He's a West Point graduate, a fine athlete. He was 22 years old. He was killed about a month after this by a North Vietnamese who had been wounded in one of our ambushes and Pete and his platoon took off after the guy, and he had enough strength left that he shot Pete across the chest with an AK, and he was killed. This is a mountain yard scout. We called him Mung. I'm not sure that was his name, because that's the language they speak, but that's what we called him. That's what he told us to call him. He had been a captive of the North Vietnamese and had been part of their conscripted army, and had escaped, surrendered to the South, and turned into what they call a Kit Carson scout. So he worked with us as a scout, trying to help us scout out North Vietnamese positions. A few months after this photograph was taken, he took a leave and tried to go home to his family up in the mountains, and was captured and murdered by the North Vietnamese as a deserter. This is Tim Piner. Tim was killed a few weeks after this picture was taken. This is Ernie Kerstetter. He made it back. Ernie was originally from Erie, Pennsylvania, and wound up in Hershey, Pennsylvania, or thereabouts. Ernie died a few years ago under very mysterious circumstances that some folks believe might have been suicide. He was suffering from a number of cancers and other issues from the Agent Orange exposure. He was a good buddy. He didn't make it. This is John Coleman. We called him Big John for obvious reasons. And by the way, Big John and Ernie and I were three of the 4 platoon sergeants at the time. Big John is alive, apparently well, and living in Houston. He came to our reunion. He was a very successful importer-exporter, and I got an email from him yesterday, and I think he's just doing fine, except for he's got some hearing loss, as we all do. So thank goodness he's alive. And then this is me over on the side, and I'm alive, as you can tell. This is Greg Ciardi, interesting guy. Greg and his wife were what we called hippies back then, and they were strong anti-war people. And his wife wanted him to desert and go to Canada. Well, not desert, but avoid the draft and go to Canada. And Greg really didn't want to live his life as an outlaw, so he allowed the Army to draft him, but he went in as a conscientious objector, became a medic, and he was our combat medic for the 3rd Platoon. One of the bravest people I ever met, just a little guy. Carried this big medic bag with all the right stuff to sew people up and try to help them if they were wounded. And so in a firefight, which we were in pretty often, every 2-3 days usually, when everybody else was hiding behind a log or behind a tree or taking whatever cover they could find, Greg was up moving around, helping the wounded. I think he came out with 2 silver stars and 1 Purple Heart, which always amazed me. I figured he probably had 3 or 4 Purple Hearts. He is retired last year. He was superintendent of schools at one of the school districts in western Massachusetts. And Greg is a very healthy 66-year-old man and doing just fine. This guy is a good friend. He was my last platoon leader. This is a photograph of him taken in Vietnam a few weeks after he and I were wounded at the same time in a firefight. It turned out to be my last firefight because they pulled me out of the field after that from the wounds. If you see these medals, you can't see them very well, they're not in color, but on his chest there is a silver star, a bronze star with V device, an air medal, and a Purple Heart that he got all at once. He stayed in the Army and retired in 1997 and has since been working with the Army Hospital, now the military hospital up in Bethesda, Maryland, where a lot of the severely wounded from Iraq and Afghanistan are coming. Here's a photograph of us a few years ago. As you can see, he put on a little weight I haven't. This guy's name is John Baca. John was a rowdy, malcontent teenager. He was in all kinds of trouble. He grew up in San Diego. In the Army, he was kind of bumping around and getting in trouble and here and the other. He was a 90mm recoilless rifle gunner. After I left Vietnam, he and his assistant gunner were on the end of an ambush patrol that got surrounded, and North Vietnamese were close to wiping them out. They were having a grenade fight He was throwing grenades, they were throwing grenades, and they threw one in, and it landed between him and his assistant gunner. He took his helmet off and rolled on it, and it went off, and it exploded through the helmet and tore out most of his insides and really ripped him up. And his assistant gunner had his legs very badly damaged. They both lived, amazingly enough. And John Baca was awarded the Medal of Honor. That's the second Medal of Honor. We had 3 that year. Here he is with a guy you might recognize at a basketball game recently where they were honoring some of the Medal of Honor winners. So John's still doing pretty well, except if you see him without his shirt, you can't imagine how the man lived through that experience. So here's me again, and I'm 67 now. I've got what the Army calls ischemic heart disease from the Agent Orange, and pretty severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and hearing loss, and tinnitus, and a couple other maladies, but I'm still vertical, and I'm holding it together pretty well. But those of us who are still alive at my age who served in Vietnam have to wonder, you know, we don't think about it too much, but how much more time do we have, you know? Because most of us probably won't live a normal lifespan. There were a little over 2.5 million Americans who served, quote unquote, on the ground in Vietnam. About 520,000 were what we call ass in the grass frontline combatants. Army infantry, Marine infantry, Special Forces, Navy SEALs, those kinds of guys. 58,232 were killed. Recognizing that a lot of people who weren't frontline infantry were killed, still that's a pretty high death rate for your frontline folks. 304,000 were wounded. That's well over half of the frontline folks. And about 2,600 went missing. The remains of about 1,000 have since been found. There were stories for a long time that there were still Americans in captivity in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and maybe in China and Russia. I honestly don't believe that's true. There's an awful lot of people killed in war they're just lost because their bodies can't be retrieved, and the military, without some affirmative way of knowing that person is definitely dead, have to report them as missing, which I think is very sad. We recovered the body from a helicopter one day, and the people who'd come out and gotten the other bodies out of it had left this body not knowing it was there because it was burned nearly to ash, but we found a leg bone in a boot and so forth. And that person had been listed as missing until we got those remains back and sent them back. So that sort of stuff happens. Very likely that all 2.6 million of us who served in Vietnam were exposed to Agent Orange, which is the most carcinogenic man-made substance ever known. And Vietnam, as you well know, produced hundreds of thousands of documented cases of post-traumatic stress syndrome, many of them quite severe. My theory on that is why there were so many more in Vietnam than were documented, at least in earlier wars, is in most wars you do things you're not very proud of and you might even be ashamed of, and you lose friends, and civilians are killed and all sorts of things happen. And that builds guilt. And then Vietnam also had the drugs and the fact that it wasn't an unpopular war. So when the Vietnam people came home, instead of getting a parade and being told by the rest of America that we were heroes and that they appreciated our service and defending them from the bad people, we kind of got the opposite treatment. You were told not to wear your uniform home. There were protesters everywhere. People got spit on and called baby burners and all that. And I think that had an effect on not alleviating some of the guilt people get from that war. Just my theory, but that's my thought. Here's some interesting comparative stuff. World War II. In only 4 years of war, 11.2% of the population of America served in uniform. Not all in combat, but they served in uniform during those 4 years. 11.2%. Vietnam lasted for 12 years, and only 4.3% of Americans served in uniform anywhere in the world during that 4 years. So a much smaller percentage of the population. Now let's bring it forward to the modern day. In Iraq and Afghanistan, since 2001, 0.45% of the population of America, less than half of 1%. 1/10 as many has served in Vietnam, and about 1/30 as many has served in World War II, have served in uniform in the last 13 years. So we have a very tiny percent of our population now who are actively serving in uniform, defending our nation from those who would change what we have. In World War II, a combat infantryman was in theater, meaning in the Pacific or in Europe or wherever, for 2 years on average, and they served in combat on average for 45 days. Some pretty severe combat, as you well know, but 45 days of combat time, 2 years of in theater time. Vietnam, it was a year. If you were in the Army, it was 13 months if you're in the Marine Corps. But our infantrymen in those two branches served in combat for an average of 245 days, right? 6 times as much combat time compressed into half as much elapsed time. So that might be a factor in why some of the combat stress started really picking up in Vietnam. But now look what we've got. Combat infantrymen in the last wars are in theater because of stop loss and other things, an average of 3 or 4 years. They keep going back and going back and going back, and they're in combat for 2 to 3 of those years. So they've got an amazing amount of combat time spread out over 3 or 4 years, several tours. You know, when we went to Vietnam as an infantryman, unless we had enlisted for a long term, we knew if we could make it back at the end of one tour, we probably weren't going to have to go back. Not true for the Marines, because usually it was a 4-year enlistment, and a lot of Marines went twice. But an Army infantryman knew if you make it back home, you're probably not going to have to go back. These poor folks, many of whom are reservists who never really signed up for this kind of treatment, tour, they just keep going back, keep going back. I know some of these people. I've talked to them about it. It's incredible to come back out of one of those tours alive and then know you're going to, 6 months later, they're going to send you back again. So the effect has been pretty dramatic on some of our modern veterans. Tragically, since September 11, 2001, about 1.7 American servicemen and women have died in combat each day. That's an unfortunately large number, but it's a very small number compared to Vietnam or compared to World War II. In Vietnam, we had days where we were losing 200 and 300 people killed, right? But just during 2012, on average, 6 Americans serving on active duty, most of them in these combat zones, committed suicide every day. We lost 3 times as many people to suicide as we lost to combat death, because the conditions of going back and going back and going back are so horrible. And even when people make it back, and I consider this even more tragic, right now, more than 18 American veterans are committing suicide every day. That's a lot. 8% of Americans are veterans, about 24 million living veterans in America. But more than 20% of them are homeless. Excuse me, more than 20% of American homeless are veterans. I said that wrong. And more than 20% of American suicide victims are veterans. So the homeless rate and the suicide rate among veterans is about 2.5 times as high as it is for the general population. Got to be something going on there, right? Here's another factor. This is me again in Vietnam. This is my body armor. It was a t-shirt I'd been wearing for 6 weeks, which started off being about yay thick. And then after you wear it for 6 weeks, it gets thinner than that. So it's kind of a joke. It wouldn't even slow a bullet down, let alone stop one, right? We didn't have body armor that we could carry in the field because the only body armor they had then was flak vests, and it was so heavy you just couldn't carry it. But now they have excellent body armor made out of Kevlar, excellent helmet, comes down low, great body armor to protect the trunk and all the organs, comes out over the shoulders, goes down through the groin. You know, knee pads, gloves, all sorts of things to protect them from wounds. But what happens? Got all these IEDs, right? The improvised explosive devices. these things are getting blown up on people. They've got body armor that protects their internal organs, so they live through the explosion, but they're getting incredible numbers of traumatic brain injury, where their head gets rattled around, they're losing their arms and legs at a terrible rate, traumatic amputations. And we've got such excellent combat surgical units now that these people are getting into surgery very quickly, and very often they're saving their lives, which is why our death rate is low, but we've got a very high rate of people who are very badly injured. I mentioned my friend John Dodson before, the guy who retired out of the Army, works up at Bethesda. I visit him once or twice a year because we're still very close. And I've had the privilege of going to Bethesda with him several times and sitting down. He's a case manager for some of the cases where people have been severely wounded. I've sat at a table in the dining room in Bethesda with him and 2 Army master sergeants, both of whom had been senior special forces people. Neither one of them had their legs. One of them was missing his left arm. The other one had both arms, but he was missing his right thumb and had a big chunk out of his forearm. They had both had traumatic brain injury. They'd both had bad internal injuries. They'd both then been there for 2 years, about, and they still weren't at the point where they were going to start working with them on prosthetic devices to help them get back on their feet again. And they were sitting there, it's humbling. I mean, they were so bravely looking at the rest of their lives, and their wives and their little kids are running around. But, you know, these are vital, energetic people who wanted to make their careers out of the Army, and they won't be in the Army anymore because the Army can't use them in that shit condition. This is a Marine Staff Sergeant who obviously has lost both his legs. He was at Bethesda when President Obama went through a year and a half or so ago. And President Obama, I thought, asked a courageous question. He asked him if he had any regrets. And this is a poster. He said, "Regrets? No, Mr. President, none that I can think of. Proud to serve." His big regret, he later revealed, was that he couldn't go back to Afghanistan with his buddies because he felt like he was letting them down. My friend Johnny Wild, who died in 2012, I was with him not too long before he passed, and he knew he didn't have much time left. And he and I talked about things that he didn't talk about with his wife or his kids or his sister or anybody else, obviously, because I was the only friend he had current day who was in Vietnam with him. And I said, kind of philosophically one day, I said, "Johnny, knowing how this turned out for you," he volunteered too. I said, "Would you still have volunteered?" And he said, "Yeah, I would have. Even if I'd known how it was going to turn out, I still would have. It was my responsibility to do what I did. And I would still do that." Brought tears to my eyes. Hell of a guy. And a good singer, I'll tell you that. So the moral of my story: war is horrible beyond the imagination of those who have not experienced it. The cost in terms of human life and human suffering is incomprehensible. The economic cost of war and its aftermath is staggering. So there's only one logical conclusion: we just got to stop having wars, right? That makes sense to everybody? Yeah. You think we will? Unfortunately. So until we do, maybe someday in the future, and even for generations after we have, I feel a big responsibility, and I think every American should, to take care of our war veterans, those who are so badly injured physically, emotionally, and their families, and the survivors of those who have died. It is, after all, the land of the free because of the brave. If it hadn't been for those brave people who fought in World War II, we'd all be speaking German or Japanese right now. I don't know how many Americans realize that these days, but that's absolutely true. In Kansas City, on any given night, there are more than 2,300 homeless veterans. Does that number surprise you? Yeah. There's a couple 100,000 homeless veterans in America on any given night, maybe 400,000 during any given year. That's a lot of people homeless. In San Diego County, they have over 20,000 homeless veterans. if I was gonna be homeless, I guess I'd wanna be homeless in San Diego. You got a heck of a veterans center there. So a lot of people are working on that. There's an organization I'll tell you about here in a little bit called the Heart of America Stand Down Foundation. I'm sure somebody have talked about, but anyway. Catholic Charities of Northwest Missouri, working with the ARCO companies, which the company I was with before I retired, and Don Roseman at Roseman and Associates, and some other people, have developed a concept for a veterans center just south of the VA Center over in Kansas City, Missouri, on Emmanuel Cleaver Boulevard. Here's an aerial drawing of it, and this is going to be housing for homeless veterans. If you're a homeless veteran, and there are a lot of these folks who kind of drop out and they don't have their stuff. So if you go to the VA for help, medical help or whatever, at some point you have to prove that you're a veteran. A lot of these folks don't carry their DD-214 around with them. It takes them a while to dig this stuff up, and maybe they need help immediately. And the VA doesn't have a lot of housing available. So this facility is being developed in conjunction with the VA, and right down the street from the VA, a couple of blocks, to give folks temporary housing, permanent housing, and a lot of medical and so psychological help until they can be absorbed into the VA hospital system, and maybe some housing after that. So this is a very worthwhile thing. They've got one in Chicago, they've got one in San Diego, they've got them in a lot of different parts of the country. It's being developed with some tax credits from the state of Missouri and from the feds, but also with a lot of money being donated to it. And they have the first building of housing just about built, and they're getting ready to start on the second one. So if you get a chance to drive over on Emmanuel Cleaver Boulevard just south of the VA hospital, take a look over there. It's pretty exciting for these folks.
What's it called?
It's called St. Michael's Veterans Center. St. Michael, I'm not a Catholic, but apparently is a patron saint of people who are brave. So knowing I was speaking to you today, I had a little piece here. Hope you don't mind, just take a couple minutes. But I told you I always wanted to be a pilot when I was a kid, and wound up most of my military flying was sitting with my feet dangling out the door of a Huey. But as I thought about my service in Vietnam, and I thought about the aircraft that were involved with us directly, I realized that more than one occasion, probably I'm still alive right now because some Air Force guy or Army aviator extracted me from a hot landing zone or provided air cover for us or so. So I thought I'd do a short little tribute. Here's the venerable UH-1D, and that could be me jumping out of that one. Also used as a gunship and a medevac. I don't know how many tens of thousands of those wound up in Vietnam, but they're still being used today, so it's a pretty good airframe. There's the AH-1 Cobra. That was introduced in '69, the year I was there. They were using Hueys as gunships before, and then they came out with the Cobra, which is a very cool machine. They ran a lot of support for us. Interesting thing is the fuselage is only 36 inches wide, so it makes a really skinny target if they're coming at you head on. Most of the Cobras wound up with shark's teeth on the front. I don't know why, it's just a thing. CH-47 Chinook. I saw a couple of them outside this morning. They did most of our heavy lifting, picked up artillery pieces, flew us from one secure area to the other. We didn't do combat assaults in Chinooks as we did in Hueys. The Marine Corps did some combat assaults in larger helicopters, but the Army considered it too vulnerable to put that many soldiers in one helicopter and put them into a hot LZ, because if it got shot down, a lot of people were going to die. And the CH-54 Sky Crane, boy, could they pick up a lot of stuff. C-123 Provider. In the book, if you read it, there's an interesting episode about the time they were moving our battalion and they pulled us out of an old French fort in C-123s with no seats. We just went inside with our water cans and our ammo crates and our C-ration crates and our weapons and our packs, sat down on the floor, He took it to the end of the runway, which was cratered with artillery craters, locked the brakes, fired up the jet assist units and turned the brakes off and had it powered up, and I bet we didn't taxi 50 feet before the thing took off, and we all just slid all the way up in the tail. It was kind of fun. Cool airplane. The Cessna Skymaster, which they were using for a lot of forward air control work. Great little plane, push-pull prop deal. Later, the Air Force was using more of the OV-10 Broncos, which is a real high-performance spotter plane. And these guys did a lot of close air support, forward air control for us, bringing in the F-4s. Most of our close air support was, if it wasn't Cobras, was by the fast movers, was F-4 Phantoms. That's what they were flying most of when I was there. It is hard to describe to people what it's like to be sitting on the ground behind a little bit of cover. And they had a rule they couldn't come within 300 meters of friendly troops and drop napalm because it was too dangerous to the troops. And you either had to call it in danger close, which was a big responsibility for the commander to do that, because if he lost people, it was his fault. Or we'd lie to him, and we'd say, okay, we're gonna pop some blue smoke, and bring it in as close as you can to the blue smoke. And then we'd send a guy out behind our position with the blue smoke about 100 meters, and he would pop this blue smoke out there. I happened to be sitting behind a log one day when an F-4 came in. You couldn't hear them coming. They came in real low to the ground. The first thing you usually heard was the 20 millimeter rounds impacting in the jungle, and then you heard the Vulcan cannon go off, and then the airplane went screaming by. With napalm, you heard the airplane go screaming by, and then there was a big, bright flash of light, a lot of fire, and all the air got sucked, all the oxygen got sucked out of the air. Well, I was sitting looking over this log when we had done that little trick, and they dropped the napalm a little too close, and it singed off all the hair on my face. I had about a week growth of beard, and it went. That was as close to napalm strike as I ever want to be. But we loved those guys. They were awesome. They kept us out of a lot of bad trouble. The A1 Sky Raider. But they didn't use too many of these with us. They flew with us a few times. That's an old, actually designed during the end of World War II. It's a Korean War aircraft. They could loiter on site for hours and hours and hours and hours and carry a ton of stuff. Somewhere in the early part of the war, they invented the minigun, and they took these C-47s and turned them to AC-47s. They started calling them Puff the Magic Dragon, which was kind of a cool name, and then some Army guy figured out that the song Puff the Magic Dragon was about smoking marijuana, and so they decided they couldn't call them that anymore, so they started calling them Spooky. And then they got replaced by the AC-130. And I probably really am alive because of one of those guys. My last night out, got wounded in the beginning of the firefight along with the platoon leader. We were surrounded by what we later found out was a regiment of North Vietnamese who had been sent into Vietnam specifically to try to wipe out an American rifle company because they wanted to kind of motivate the American people to be even more, stronger protests against the war. So we were surrounded, and they were chewing us up pretty badly, and a lot of us were already wounded. And we brought in artillery way too close, and we tried to bring in the F-4s, but it was dark, and they didn't want to come in that quick. So we put up, they told us to put up a strobe light in the middle of the perimeter, which we really didn't want to do, but, and the C-130 gunship came in with the miniguns. And when that minigun goes off, it sounds like a big, long, kind of a burr, and there's like a red waterfall, 6,000 rounds a minute. Every 8th round is a red tracer. So you just get this big red stream of gunfire coming down. And he got really close and chewed up a lot of the North Vietnamese, and then we were able to kind of clean up the rest of it. And so we're alive today because maybe this guy right here could be. And then possibly our favorite was the B-52. The B-52 strikes in Vietnam were called arc lights. They bombed from 33,000 feet, I believe. They had so many bombs that they had to fly, they had to make 2 runs at the target because they couldn't drop all the bombs on one pass. So you could set your watch by 5 minutes between the first pass and when they dropped the bombs, the earth would shake. I've been near a target and told, mount up and get away. You have to be at least a click and a half from the target before the B-52s come tonight. And so we had humped like crazy to get away, and we didn't quite make 1,500 meters. And when the B-52s dropped bombs, it would lift you off the ground like an earthquake from that distance away. It's an incredible thing. And then you go back the next morning and you don't recognize the terrain. It looks like the surface of the moon. It is unbelievable. Every 500-pound bomb crater is about 30 feet deep and 30 feet across and cone-shaped, and they're one after the other with nothing in between them. It is amazing what they do. This photograph, if you can tell, is shot across LZ Grant, and that's a B-52 strike off in the distance. Those are not clouds, from about 2 miles away. And they raise that much dust from a wet jungle environment. So, amazing aircraft. My personal flying story, I never did get a pilot's license, but I was down in Kissimmee, Florida a few years ago, and there's a guy down there, got a TF-51 Mustang that you can fly in the rear seat, and he lets you fly the plane and he talks you through it. And so I went up with him for one of his extremely expensive 1-hour flights, and we had a ball. Got to do loops and rolls and Immelmans and Cuban S's and all manner of things. There I am in that's my official 1-hour flight helmet. And this is known in the family as Gary's Top Gun picture. As soon as we got off the ground, he gave me the controls, and that was so much fun. That was a lot of fun. He even let me land it, talked me through it, of course. So that's my flying story. I got a few books with me today if anybody's interested. One kind of tells my story. I wrote it as a memoir to try to help get some of the crap out of my head about 10 years ago. And then I showed it to some of my war buddies, and they read it and said, well, you need to publish this because I think it'll help other combat veterans explain to their families what the war was like. So I turned it into a book, and then I realized there was stuff in there I really didn't want to publish with real names because there's some people in there who didn't behave the way I thought they should, or I don't think the way anybody thought they should. So I fictionalized it, added a couple of stories that I wasn't personally involved in, but that close friends were involved in, and I took out a couple of things and I turned it into a novel. And I used to sell them and keep the money, and then I started donating part of the proceeds to charities. And then that turned out to be kind of a hassle running a small business to sell a book. So what I'm doing now is I buy the books, and I will give you a book if you will donate $20, which I will pass the entire $20. I was going to do the Heart of America Stand Down Foundation. Ron talked about doing the Wounded Warrior Project. I found out recently the Wounded Warrior Project is extremely well funded, so I thought I'd put a little money into one of the local organizations. Stand Down Foundation does 2 stand downs a year, and they bring the homeless veterans in off the street twice a year, get them a place to stay, some clothes, some boots, some legal assistance, whatever they need. It's a really worthwhile organization. So if you don't mind, I'll donate the proceeds from today to the Stand Down Foundation, and if anybody wants one, I'll be happy to autograph it for you. And that is the end of my story, unless there are some questions.
Two questions. Why didn't they take you out of the field more often? And number 2 is, did you have any sense of objective when you were over there, or was it all just sort of milling around, taking a hill, losing it, taking it again, etc.?
Great questions. They didn't take us out of the field more often because, in my view, they didn't feel the same obligation they do towards soldiers today, that they were volunteers and that they wanted to treat them well so that they would stay in the military and, perpetuate their service. Just my opinion, but a lot of the senior officer corps believed that most of the grunts were draftees, that we were there for one tour, that we were there because even though we didn't want to be, that we were an undisciplined mass, and they just felt like we could do more good if we just stayed out there and became guerrillas ourselves, in fact, to fight against a guerrilla force. There were 4 companies in the battalion, 4 rifle companies, and so we theoretically went back to the fire base 1 week a month, but my company, maybe they didn't like us very well. We didn't get back there very often, and usually when we got back there, it was only for 3 or 4 days. And sometimes it was so nasty and not fun on the fire base, we were kind of glad to get back off and go back out in the bush. In terms of sense of mission, that is a really good question. I went there as a volunteer because I felt like I was going to help save the world from communism. My family had invested in that with my uncle's death, and my family had always tried to help America. And I was a sergeant when I went over, so I had some rank and theoretically some level of responsibility. Most of the time, I didn't know where we were going that day. If I wasn't the point squad or the point platoon, I didn't even know what compass bearing that we were taking off on. I didn't know what our goal was for the day. Our goal for most days was, walk a click or a click and a half and see if you can run into some North Vietnamese, and if you can, engage them, and then, try to kill them if they don't kill you first, and then if they're bigger than you are, then we'll pull you back and we'll try to blow them up with some artillery or some aircraft and all that. So part of the reason we had such terrible discipline problems in Vietnam, I think, is because people didn't have any sense of mission. The grunts didn't have a sense of mission. We were meat. We were bait. That's all we were. You're walking out there at point on an infantry company in the field in that environment, not even know where you're going or why you're going there. You don't feel too good about what you're doing. Yeah. Other questions?
Were most of your movements company size or platoon size when you were moving?
Most of our daily movements were company size. But at the end of every day, well, not every day, but often we'd break up into platoon size units, or even squad units, or fire team units. We'd send out 2, 3, 4 ambush patrols every night. They'd go out 400 or 500 meters outside the company perimeter, and that would usually be a squad, or sometimes a smaller 3 or 4 man group. And then you went out around the company perimeter. You had listening posts, and that was 3 guys. The mission of the listening post was to die noisy. If you were attacked by the North Vietnamese at night, you were supposed to make a lot of noise before they killed you. That was the point of it. And so, yeah, we never worked as a battalion. It was always at least a company, or maybe smaller than that. Very often
How
smaller.
many men in a company?